Last I checked, there are approximately 85 billion fly patterns on the market, with something like 36,000 new ones being added every single month. For the fly angler who really just wants to keep things simple, especially when it comes to picking the right fly, where do you start? Which of those endless patterns do you actually need, and which ones were just tied to catch the attention of the angler and maybe not so much the fish? Believe it or not, you can trim your fly box down to 12 patterns and have plenty of variety to catch 99% of the trout that you encounter. Listen to the rest of this episode of Untangled to discover the patterns that every fly angler needs in their box. This is Untangled, Fly Fishing for Everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant, ready for yet another week of podcast excellence. And I would appreciate it if y'all would bear with me a little bit this week. I am just getting over being extremely sick. I was so sick, I did not fish for 8 days. And you know when that happens, that's serious. If I'm not out on the water, and oh my goodness, it kicked my butt. I have not been that sick in a long time. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk all about fly fishing, and specifically this week, we're going to talk about downsizing your fly box. And if you could only fish with 12 flies, what would those flies be? We get a lot of questions surrounding flies, which, I mean, shouldn't be too much of a surprise given that we are a fly company. We sell flies. It's in our name. That's where Ventures Fly Co. got started, right? But we get a lot of questions, and I've received quite a few lately from listeners and viewers who keep asking some variation of the question of, like, what flies would you fish with if you only had a few with you? And one listener, Austin from Texas, he put it this way. He wrote in and said, what are the main fly patterns that would be a good idea to keep in your fly box? Why? Explaining the patterns and their significance / usage would be appreciated. I am a beginner. Demystifying these patterns would help me tremendously. Well, Austin, you came to the right place, and I really do. I love that you asked the why. That's a question that a lot of beginners don't always ask. I don't think that they really need to, but obviously you listen to Untangled, and for anybody who might be new here or just found us, answering the why behind questions is a huge part of why VFC exists in the first place and why we've created all this media, because the why behind what we do things isn't always explained very well to beginners. And I firmly believe, along with everybody else here at VFC, that if you want to be proficient at something, you want to get good at it, especially fly fishing, it's not enough to just know, okay, here's how you cast, here's how you catch a fish. You got to understand the why behind doing certain things, because once you understand that, everything else clicks. You understand it on a deeper level, and you become much better at it. So it's a key to being good at something. And I just really appreciate, Austin, that you asked that to start us off. So with that in mind, folks, you're going to want to get comfy. Maybe grab a plate of wings, get your Diet Coke ready, because I'm going to reveal the 12 patterns that I think every angler needs in their box. I'm going to explain why those flies should be there, and then what those flies represent. So when would you pick this fly versus a different fly? So we'll really dive into it. And I did spend some time going through my own fly box and looking at it and thinking, all right, well, what would I actually cut mine down to? Because I don't have only 12 patterns in my box. I've got closer to 20, 24, maybe about 2 dozen. I tie just a lot of variations of emergers and cripples, so I have a lot of different bugs like that in my box. But if I only could have like 1 or 2 emerger patterns, I could get by with it. I always have this existential fear of it not having enough emergers, especially during mayfly hatches. So I'm always tying up new patterns. I'm always trying new ones out, and it's proven to work for me. We were on the green a couple weeks ago, me and Alex, and the cripples that I tied actually saved my bacon and a couple of the emergers. So we'll talk about those. If you don't know what a cripple is or an emerger is, I'll get into those. in a minute. So don't worry. Like I said, get comfy. We're going to be here for a minute going through these flies. And I have not listed these in order of importance or anything. These are just the patterns. So if you want to take notes, feel free. You might want to. All right, we're going to start with fly number 1, and it is the Parachute Adams. This is arguably the most popular dry fly ever created, and that's because it really imitates just about any kind of adult aquatic insect. It can pass as a mayfly or a caddis. I know folks who fish really small ones even during midge hatches and sometimes have success with them as well. I've also known folks who fish really big ones during stonefly hatches, and sometimes that works. They're not as good of an imitation of stoneflies just because uh, they're not tapered correctly. They're not built the same way stoneflies are, but in a pinch, maybe they'll work. They just look buggy though. That's the selling point of the Parachute Adams. They just look like a bug. Now, I fish a Parachute Adams during mayfly hatches, and I also use it as the top fly in my dry dropper rig on a lot of small streams. And like I said, the small Parachute Adams can even work well during midge hatches. It can kind of unmatch the hatch in those situations with the midge hatches. I think that's why some folks will throw it. I recommend having a Parachute Adams. You want these in your box anywhere from size 12 to 18. I've got a couple of each with a heavy emphasis on the 14s and the 16s. I got a lot of those. You will never be unhappy if you have a bunch of these in your box. It's a good searching fly, and that's a term that you might hear other flies referred to as often, and all that means is anglers are using that fly when they're casting and looking for fish, but they're not casting directly to risers. They throw it out there looking to see, all right, is a fish there? Are they going to hold there? Because the Parachute Adams will just bring some fish up. It just looks buggy. It's a good fly to have. You can never have enough of them, in my opinion. So that's fly number 1. Fly number 2, the Elk Hair Caddis. So caddis and mayflies, those are your two, and midges. So there's 3. I do not want to shortchange the midge. You never want to shortchange a midge, right? Well, those 3 species of bugs, those are the main food items in every trout river in the world. If you've got a mayfly, a midge, and a caddis imitation of some kind in your box for both their nymph and their dry fly stages, and you go out to a trout stream, you're going to catch fish. It really is that simple. It doesn't get too much more complex than that. Yes, we've got stoneflies, and we've got terrestrials, and we've got stuff like scuds and sow bugs and worms, and those are great. You need them. I believe you need those other flies. But if you just boil it down, if you want to get super simple, just have 9 flies. Caddis, mayflies, midges. That is the absolute bare bones. But we're going to go a little bit beyond that. Trout will always recognize one of those 3 main species of insects, which is why you always want to have some kind of caddis imitation in there. And the Elk Hair Caddis, it's a staple for a reason. It's famous. It just works very, very well for imitating adult caddis flies. It's also another fantastic searching fly, just like the Parachute Adams, and it is a go-to for anglers from early summer all the way through fall. The Elk Hair Caddis is great to use in a dry dropper rig because it floats high. It can support some heavier nymphs. I'll fish an Elk Hair Caddis often, especially if I'm fishing rougher water. Then I'll throw the Elk Hair Caddis on instead of the Parachute Adams because it just floats a little bit better, I've found. Sizes 12 to 18 are perfect. That is what I would recommend having in your box. The color, I haven't found the colors matter too much, but a variety of colors, brown and tan, are going to cover your bases pretty well. Black as well, that'll work for you. Fly number 3, the Sparkle Dun. Now, the Sparkle Dun, it imitates an emerging or crippled mayfly. When mayflies, and caddis do this too, midges do this as well, but we really focus in on it with the mayflies because it's the trout seem to key in on those a little bit more, right? So when mayflies change from their larval form, which is what we would call the nymph, right? They're living underneath the water, they're in their nymph stage, and then they change into that adult, which we also call the dun stage. they emerge into that adult stage, and we call these emergers. And as an emerger, they often will get stuck in the surface film of the river while they are crawling out of their shuck and their wings are drying off before they can fly away from the water and go do whatever bugs do up in the trees. The sparkle dun, this arguably might be my favorite fly. I've talked to Alex about it so much lately. I think he's sick of hearing me say, oh, it's just tying on a sparkle dun. But I love them. They're so good. The sparkle dun, it sits really low in the water, and it looks just like a mayfly that's stuck in the surface film trying to get its wings dry or to escape that shuck that I talked about. This is my go-to fly during mayfly hatches, and I will often catch more fish on the sparkle dun than I do on any of the other mayfly patterns I have in my box. I fish these in sizes 18 and 20. I don't really vary from those sizes at all. Those are just my go-to. I focus on like an Adams gray body and then some olive bodies as well. The focus really is on darker bodies, though. I found that really helps it out. I cannot overstate how much I love the sparkle dun and how well it works for me during mayfly hatches. You just gotta have them. All right, fly number. I'm gonna forget the number, so we're just gonna go on to the next one here. I didn't number them on my notes here. I should have. The next fly, though, is the zebra midge. Now, we've talked a lot about caddis, and we talked about our mayflies. I also got to mention our midges, right? Midges are a huge food source in every river. Midges are the only bug that's going to hatch year-round. You'll find them hatching in the winter, even when the mayflies and the caddis are not hatching. Midges are great for that. I love them. You need some kind of midge nymph imitation just because of how prevalent midges are everywhere. There's tons of them. They're in every river. You've got to have them. And it is hard to find a better midge nymph imitation than the zebra midge. I have caught some of my best fish ever on a zebra midge. I caught a couple of years ago. Well, no, it was closer to, how long has it been? 4 years ago since I moved to Wyoming. I caught a 25-inch rainbow on a size 18 zebra midge. Right, some of my best fish have come on zebra midges. You just can't go wrong with them. It's super simple to tie. That's the great thing. You can tie these up yourself. I taught my wife how to tie flies, and the first fly I taught her how to tie was the zebra midge, and hers looked great. I caught fish on the ones that she tied for me. It's fantastic. You're never going to have a hard time finding zebra midges. They're for sale in every fly shop. We've got bunches of them in our fly collections. They just flat out work. All right, you're going to want these in sizes 14 to 20. That's really going to cover you for some of the bigger midges and then down to the small stuff. Next fly is the hare's ear. Hare's ears are an old school fly that I don't see as many anglers using as I used to, and I don't know why that is, but I love them. It's kind of a do-it-all nymph that imitates just about every form of aquatic insect except midges. You can use a really big stonefly nymph or a really big hare's ear to imitate stonefly nymphs. I actually do that here in my neck of the woods in Wyoming. We get a lot of big stonefly hatches, and the trout really key in on them. And I was all out of my favorite stonefly patterns. The only thing I had was like a size 10 hare's ear, a giant one. Threw that on, and I caught plenty of fish one day during a pretty good stonefly hatch. So they'll work for that. In their smaller sizes, they can pass as a caddis or a mayfly nymph. It's just, they're indispensable. Every angler needs to have some hare's ears. They work great in lakes too. So even if you're not on rivers, they're a great lake nymph. They're just a wonderful, wonderful all-around bug. I do like them in sizes 14 to 18, but you can even go up to a 10 or an 8 if you want to imitate your stonefly nymphs with the bigger ones. And in that same vein, I also am going to recommend that everybody has a Frenchie or a pheasant tail, right? You can have both, but I'm not going to list both because that would put us to 13 instead of 12. But either one of these, the Frenchie is just a version of the pheasant tail. I like it because it's a little bit simpler, quicker tie. I don't have to do the legs or the wing case. So it saves me a couple of steps when I'm tying up these bugs. So I fish a lot of Frenchies. I also think there's something about that little hot spot that the trout just love. So I love tying those on as well. It works as a mayfly nymph, but it will also pass as a caddis nymph as well. Again, I prefer the Frenchie because They're a little bit easier to tie than the pheasant tail, and I think the flash and the contrast of colors on the body in the Frenchie make it more enticing to fish. One of the very few things that we know for sure about trout is that they are attracted to contrasting colors. They love that contrast, and the Frenchie does that quite nicely with the hot spot and then the collar and then the darker body. There's a lot of contrast going on. This is one of my personal favorite go-to droppers whenever I'm fishing a high mountain stream or any kind of river from early summer to late fall. I've almost always got a Frenchie on. It's almost a running joke between me and Alex whenever we go out on the water that, oh, yeah, I caught that on a Frenchie. Alex, guess what I caught it on? And he's almost always going to say, Frenchie? And he's usually getting them on midges or some new caddis nymphs that he dreams up because Alex is always dreaming something up like that. It's kind of fun. Anyways, you'll want your Frenchies or your pheasant tails in your box from sizes 14 all the way to size 18. All right, our next pattern is the Last Chance Cripple. I mentioned earlier that I don't feel like I ever have enough variety of crippled mayfly patterns or emerging mayfly patterns. Any of those mayflies that sit in the surface film and act as either an emerger or a cripple, there are so many variations. There's so many different takes on those that I feel like I never have enough. And I was actually thinking about this the other day. Why do we have so many different variations of it? And that's a question that I'm sure if I sat down and really thought through it, I could come up with a logical, more in-depth answer. But I think the short of it is that there are so many different ways an emerging mayfly can appear to a trout that we just have a lot of different variations of them for that exact reason. But the Last Chance Cripple, you've got your sparkle done that I talked about earlier. That can pass as a cripple, but that's a lot better. In my experience, I found that's a lot better as an emerger pattern than a cripple. And if the fish are really keyed in on the cripples, if they're looking for those, then the Last Chance Cripple is hard to beat. And I've even found during mayfly hatches, when they're eating a lot of adults, they'll often key in on the cripple instead, if you throw that out there, instead of the adult, because it's easier for them to get at. It's sitting lower and there's less chance of it escaping before the trout gets there. So often they'll key in on that cripple sometimes, more so than the adults. In fact, when Alex and I were on the green a couple of weeks ago, that's exactly what happened. The second day that we fished, I caught all of my fish on a cripple. So they're an indispensable fly for that exact reason. The Last Chance Cripple in particular is a time-tested cripple pattern. It was developed on the Henry's Fork over there in Last Chance, Idaho, and I've found that it works just about anywhere, even with that. I tie these in 14s and 16s. You don't generally need to go much smaller than that for cripples, at least in my experience. If you go much smaller than that, they do become pretty difficult to tie. So keep that in mind. Your next fly here is the Griffith Gnat. Now, the Griffith Gnat, it's not an exact replica of it, but it works really, really good during midge hatches. It imitates either a single midge if you tie them really small, or it can imitate a cluster of midges. Either way, it looks fishy, and trout love them. It is just hard to beat the Griffith Gnat. Whenever you find trout that are taking smaller flies and you don't have an exact match for those, I found that a Griffith Gnat can help carry you through. They're solid. I do tie them small, though. I like them in sizes 18 to 22. So I go pretty small with the Griffith Gnats, again, because the really small ones can imitate single midges, whereas your 18s can imitate a cluster, maybe. Now, before anybody gets worried that I'm going to get to the end of this list and not have a streamer of some kind, I've got the woolly bugger. That's your next fly. In my opinion, you could also switch out the woolly bugger with some kind of rabbit leech, like a slump buster, maybe. But either way, you need either a woolly bugger or a rabbit leech, because it's always good to have a streamer pattern around. Streamers are meant to imitate bait fish, other small fish, crawdads, sculpin, or even leeches. They work very well to trigger a trout's predatory response and initiate a strike in the same way that lures do. They go by and the fish is either hungry and wants it, or the fish is aggressive and wants it away from it, it's being territorial, and so goes to eat it. Either way, it's going to trigger that predatory response from a trout. The woolly bugger, it's so good because they imitate just about anything, and you can fish them on the swing, you can strip them, you can dead drift them, and the woolly bugger will just get the job done. I've also found, though, that I really like what rabbit leeches, especially like a slump buster. I really like how they appear in the water. I just love how they swim. I think they're a solid bug, and I don't think you go wrong with having either of those. You definitely want to size up a little bit, though. I would tie these in sizes 6 through 10 if you're going to focus on just that for your streamer selection. Another fly that I would be completely remiss if I did not mention is my favorite stonefly nymph in the world, a Pat's rubber legs. I think every trout angler needs a good big stonefly nymph. Even if there aren't a ton of stoneflies around you, chances are that big stonefly nymph is still going to attract some fish. And I've been fishing the Pat's rubber legs a lot the last 3 or 4 years, and I've caught more fish on that nymph than I can count. It's like it wakes up in the morning, it grabs its lunchbox, it goes out there, and it just gets to work. It just does the job, doesn't complain. It's the ideal employee, and dadgummit if you don't want one of those in your fly box, am I right? Well, they sink like a rock. It's durable, and the fish just love it. I've found on one of my local streams here, there are a lot of stoneflies. And the Pat's rubber legs is the one fly that they will consistently take from early in the spring all the way through fall. You can't really fish the creek in the winter. It's at the bottom of this really steep canyon, and it ices up, and there's just no way to access it. It gets so icy and covered in snow. But when you can get in there, I've caught fish on Pat's rubber legs every month of the year except like December, January, February. So except for those 3 months out of the year, I can get into fish reliably with that Pat's rubber legs. They're just fantastic. I fish these in a size 8 through 12, but the ones that I prefer the most are size 10. And this is the bug that I most often use as my dropper these days, to be completely honest with you. Just by virtue of where I live and the fish that I'm going for, I pick up a Pat's rubber legs almost all the time. I love it. Now, to go with that Pat's rubber legs, that's a pretty big nymph, right? You're going to need a big dry fly to hold it up, and that's where your Stimulator or your Chubby Chernobyl, one of the two. If I had to pick, I'd pick the Chubby Chernobyl because it's easier to tie and it's way more durable than the Stimulator. However, the Stimulator has a lot going for it because they probably float a little bit better, and they do a better job of imitating bigger stoneflies, I think, than the Chubby. But the Chubby's just, I love the Chubby, right? The Chubby can imitate like a big terrestrial insect, and this goes for the Stimulator as well, right? They can imitate those big terrestrial insects like a grasshopper, or they can pass as that big stonefly. I found that Chubbies tied in different colors work well during stonefly hatches, and again, I just love that the Chubby is so easy to tie and it floats so well. And they're really durable. In fact, last summer, I fished the same Chubby for almost a month before it finally got demolished and I had to tie something else on. I love flies that are like that just last and just go for you. And the flies that really tug at your heartstrings when you finally lose them to a tree, right? It's okay to lose them to a fish, but to get it stuck in a tree, that just feels personal in some ways. I tie these in sizes 8 to 12, but again, the size that I fish the most often is a size 10. And during the summer, that is my top fly in my dry dropper rig. I love it. Can't get enough of the Chubbies. And rounding out our dozen is some kind of egg or glow bug imitation. I might get a little bit of flack for this, but I think everybody needs some kind of egg pattern or glow bug in their box. When trout spawn, eggs become a food source. Now, you shouldn't ever fish to trout that are actively spawning. You don't want to do that because that can impact the next generation of trout in any given river. But, for example, think about we're in the spring right now. Our rainbows and our cutthroat are spawning. And the browns, if there are brown trout around, will be stacked up nearby to eat the eggs that drift out of the nests, which we call reds. And that same thing happens again in the fall when the brown trout spawn. The rainbows will stack up behind those reds to eat the eggs as they drift out. And eggs they're a well-known food source. Fish recognize them, and they're present in rivers for a good chunk of the year. So it never hurts to have a couple of those. In fact, we've got an egg pattern here that Alex tied up, and that thing saved our bacon this winter more than either of us really wanted to admit. Probably those were great flies for us this winter. They're a great attractor nymph. They just get the attention of trout. I like them in a size 10 to 14. That'll really do the job for you. But those right there, folks, those are your 12. Pardon me, I almost shortchanged you 2 flies there. Those are your 12 flies that I would recommend everybody have in their box. Again, I have a little bit more variety just because I like to tie a lot of different emergers. I've been trying to handle a lot of different nymph patterns lately. I'm trying to improve my nymphing game, so I do have quite a few of those in my box. Like I said, I probably got close to 2 dozen patterns. And one that was hard for me to leave off this list, honestly, was a Paragon. I've been fishing Paragons more and more lately. They're great on the smaller streams because their profile is so small. They'll still sink really well, but they don't make as big of a splash. So they're really great on the smaller, clear water where the fish are a little bit spookier, but you still need to get a nymph down to them because they don't want to dry fly for whatever reason. I've really enjoyed those. That was the only one that was tough for me to leave off the list, but I'm confident that if you fish the bugs on this list, you're going to be fine for like 99% of the trout that you run into. Now, if you've got questions about any of the flies that I mentioned here or anything else, please do not hesitate to drop us a line and get in touch. I'd love to chat with you more about flies, but enough about flies because we've got the Q&A section of the show coming on up. We've got some wonderful questions, so get yourself comfortable and get ready for that. Our first question this week comes to us from Jack from Ohio. He writes in and says, I am learning how to fly fish in small local ponds, but the larger lakes probably need a different approach given winds and terrain. I have been using a 5-weight 9-foot rod. Should I consider a longer rod? I also have mainly fished woolly buggers and a few streamers. Any tips to attack these lakes from the bank? Hey, Jack, great question. I appreciate this a lot. And I think a lot of us are thinking about lake fishing right now because for those of us in the mountainous areas, runoff has begun and the lakes are just starting to ice out. And one thing that you'll find, especially as Jack articulated here, is that lakes can be kind of tricky. I enjoy a 10-foot 6-weight on larger lakes. I fish those quite a bit. That extra reach is nice, along with the extra punch you get from a 6-weight. It can be a little bit easier to cast further with those, but they are certainly not necessary. You can do plenty of lake fishing with just your 9-foot 5-weight. So I don't want you to feel like you've got to run out and buy a 10-foot 6-weight to be effective at lakes. I'm not the world's best lake angler. I'll admit that right off the bat. Of all the fly fishing that I've done, my Stillwater game needs the most love. I'm not patient as I should be, and it really shows up on the Stillwater because I just get frustrated and I'll just say, to heck with it and go find a river somewhere because that's what I'd rather fish anyways. But I've had the most luck fishing lakes by using a nymph setup where I fish some kind of micro leech and then a chironomid beneath an indicator. A chironomid, for those who don't know, it's basically just a giant midge that hatches in Stillwater. I'll tie those onto my tippet with a fancy knot that fly anglers call it a non-slip mono loop, but it's just the same thing as a Rapala knot. Again, because we use it in fly fishing, we've got to give it a fancy name because heaven forbid we call it a Rapala knot. Whatever. All this knot does is lets the fly move around more freely in the water, which gives it a more lifelike appearance. I've found that helps on Stillwater. I just tend to have more success with that rig than I do with stripping streamers, but stripping streamers is definitely more engaging. It is a lot more fun. So if you're looking for something to keep your mind occupied, I would go with the stripping streamers route. The key with lakes and ponds, though, is and this is something that once I finally realized this, it did make my lake fishing become less arduous because once I finally understood this, I found a lot more success. But the key is just to fish around structure, just like we do on rivers. We're always looking for certain kinds of structure. We want a riffle, or we want a pool, or we want to run, or we want an eddy. Those are specific. Those are water types, right? The structure would maybe be like the boulders or the logs, but the boulders and logs and the rocks, they create a lot of those different water types. You want to look for the same kinds of things on a lake: sunken logs, rocks, steep drop offs, weed beds, things like that. They all provide places for trout to hide out from predators, but they can dart out and grab food as it drifts by. And I really want to draw your attention to the drop offs, the weed beds, anywhere that there's a transition. Like if it goes from really shallow to really deep suddenly, that's our drop off. Right on that transition line, especially in Stillwater, fish will hang out on that all the time. It's also a good idea if there's a point on the lake where it juts out, the shoreline juts out into the lake a little bit more and forces a point where all the fish would have to swim around it if they're cruising the shore. That's another great place to set up shop. Uh, Really, though, you're looking for anywhere that a fish can hang out and catch or ambush some food as it drifts by or as the fish swims around. That's going to be a great place. There's this one lake back in Utah that I used to fish all the time when I lived in Utah. It was my favorite to go for ice off fishing because if you could make it through the snow drifts, if you could buck your snow drifts and get on the north end of it, there was this beautiful drop off about 10, 15 feet off the bank. And if you just put a couple of midges right there, a couple of those chironomids I was talking about, right on that drop off and put them like 8, 9 feet down, it was just money. You'd catch more fish you know what to do with, including some really big ones. I saw a guy catch like a 6-pound cutthroat and a tiger trout that was like 25, 26 inches long. It was huge, doing that same thing. Now, I caught 13-inch rainbows all day, but he caught these huge fish doing the same thing I was doing, just fishing that drop off. It's a really big shelf that goes for a long ways on that lake. And I can't overstate just how important it is to fish on those transition points. That's going to be a big key for you in having success in Stillwater. And we actually do have an entire podcast episode dedicated to this topic. I'll link that in the podcast description so you can have a listen to that if you want. Jack, thank you so much for sending your question on in. I appreciate it. Shane from Wisconsin has our next question, writes in and says, now that I am 50, my eyesight is suffering slowly, and I find myself struggling to tie delicate lines. What do you recommend for helping an angler who struggles tying in that case? I've always been skeptical of those line tying gadgets I see at fishing shows, and by the way, I have no idea what people are doing with Diet Coke or Pepsi, Diet Mountain Dew. Shane, this is a really good question, and this might hurt you a little bit. I just can't do the Diet Dew. I know tons of folks who love it, and Alex loves Mountain Dew Zero. I mean that he loves that more than Coke Zero. He won't admit that, but I'll go out. Well, maybe he will, but I'll say it first. I'll break the news here first. He loves that stuff. It just tastes so off to me. Mountain Dew Zero or the Diet Dew, it's so bitter. It's hard. The Mountain Dew, it's so perfect, the fully leaded stuff, that a diet version of it it can't live up to that perfection that is a nice, cold, crisp Mountain Dew. Ugh. All right, this ain't a soda podcast. I'll get off that. One of my good fishing buddies here in Wyoming, I talked to him about this. He's 60, and I asked him, I said, well, what do you use? Because he's got a few different things he's tried out to help him tie on flies. I tie a lot of his flies on for him. Because one thing, I'll make fun of my old friends for just about everything about getting old, except the eyesight issue, because I know that's coming for me, and I'm not going to make fun of anybody for it because I know I'm going to deal with it. I'm already deaf in one ear, so I can make fun of them for not hearing, but never make fun of my buddies for eyesight issues. Anyways, I asked him what he likes to use, and he's got a pair of flip-down magnifiers. I'm wearing a hat. If you're watching the video podcast, you can see. They just clip onto his hat brim right here, and he can flip them down just so that he can see. They rest right over his eyes, and he can just tie right just like that. I asked him how he likes them. He says they make all the difference in the world. He's also tried those click expandable reading glasses that Kelly Gallup sells, and he likes those, but he still prefers those flip down magnifiers. So those are the two that he's really extensively used. My suggestion, Shane, would be to try a bunch of different ones until you find one that works for you. Often the gadgets you see at the fly fishing shows do work, so I would not hesitate to put some faith in them. But thank you for sending that question in, Shane. I appreciate it. Marvin from Missouri has got another question for us, and he says, "Hey, Spencer, love your podcast. You may have touched on this, but here goes anyway. I have been looking to get a pair of sunglasses. There seems to be so many variations, not to mention prices. I primarily fish on lakes for panfish and such, none of which are crystal clear, if you know what I mean. Is there such a thing as an all-around pair of sunglasses? That is, for sunny, cloudy, and all phases in between. Thanks for your podcast. Keep the line tight." Hey, Marvin, thanks for listening. I appreciate that you listen to the show. Thank you so much. And thank you for your question as well. I appreciate you giving me the chance to go back onto this topic. I'm like strangely passionate about sunglasses, mostly because it blows my mind when I see people fishing, any kind of fishing, just being out on the water, even without sunglasses. I don't understand it. They're an essential piece of gear in the gear section of our beginner fly fishing masterclass for a reason, right? You're out on the water for hours. You've got all of that light reflecting off the water. And if you don't take care of your eyes, you're literally going to be in a world of hurt. It is not going to be fun. You need a good pair of sunglasses. And not only do you need any sunglasses, you need polarized sunglasses, because the polarization of the lenses cuts the glare as much as possible. So it's less strain on your eyes, and it's got the added benefit of enabling you to see into the water a little bit, depending on water clarity and whatnot, and lighting and such. But those polarized sunglasses, you need them. You can get polarized is polarized, okay? You can get a $20 pair at a gas station or at Walmart or whatever, or you can go spend a good chunk of change on a real fancy pair. It doesn't matter. You've got to have polarized sunglasses. All right, I'll step off my soapbox. For your all-around fishing, I would recommend a brown or an amber lens. That is going to be your best all-around lens color. I wear blues sometimes, but blue can be, I don't know, it's just a little too gray when it gets really dark. Amber lenses can kind of run into that as well, but I've just found that amber or brown lenses really work well for me as an all-around lens color. And again, you can go with whatever brand you like, but I'm not going to push you towards any brand in particular. But I personally wear Costa and Bahio lenses. Those are the two that I wear all the time. And that depends on the day, because I like one brand's lens color versus another brand's lens color. So I'll switch them out. But I am almost always with that brown or amber lens. It's just, they work well when it's cloudy. They're fantastic in the sun. They're just fantastic to have. And as a little side note here, I'll tell you as well that I've been fishing with a pair of low light lenses. They're yellow. They're like shooting glasses, basically, but they're polarized. And oh my goodness, when it's super cloudy and overcast, those make all the difference in the world. I was blown away. I could see so much better. It was fantastic. So if you don't mind carrying an extra pair of glasses around, you have the money for two pairs, maybe take a look at a low light lens. I was really, really impressed with how it did for me. I also did an entire episode on sunglasses as well. I'll link that in the podcast description so that you can go into that in a little bit more detail if you so choose. Thank you so much for sending that question in. Our next question comes to us from a KC from Utah. Writes in and says, "How do I fish deeper holes? My local stream, for the most part, is pretty shallow. Most of it is about 1 to 3 feet deep, but there are a couple holes that are way deeper, like 4 to 8 feet deep. I know there are good fish in those holes because my dad is hooked into a good brown in one of them, and they just look too good and not have fish. What tips do you have for deeper water, flies to use, depth to fish, etc.?" Casey, this is a good question. Thank you for sending it in. These deeper pools, they can feel intimidating. And speaking of pools, we did just release a masterclass episode all about fly fishing pools. I'll link that in the podcast description. I think y'all might find that very illuminating and, dare I say, hilarious. It was one of my best yet. Uh, it really came together well. I was really happy with it. Um, anyways, I'll link that in the podcast description for you guys if you want to take a look at video for it. Now, back to the pool itself. They can feel intimidating, right? But they're actually pretty easy to fish. The way I like to do it is you want to get to that pool first and just sit there for a minute. Don't fish, don't do anything. Just sit there and watch because you want to see if there are any trout rising. If the trout are rising, then you want to tie a dry fly on, try and imitate it as best you can, and hit the fish that might be holding, or hit those fish that are eating the dry fly. Cast to them. Okay, once you've caught them or they've ignored it, then I found it helps to tie on a dry dropper rig. And you're going to try to hit those fish that might be holding in that upper third of the water column. Right? Once you've done that, then you can move on to your next one. But before you do that, I also want to recommend that it is helpful to fish the pool in like a grid pattern. You want to work close to far, so fish the water closest to you first, and then get further out to you and cover as much of it as you possibly can. If you visualize a grid on the water and you put your fly in each square, you're going to be in good shape for covering all the water. It helps you just make sure you're not missing any place that a fish might be, because with pools, the fish don't necessarily all hang out in a predictable spot. They're pretty unpredictable. So you want to cover all the water just to make sure you've really done as much as you can to catch the fish that are in those pools. Now, if you're throwing your dries in your dry dropper, you're still not getting anything, or you think, like KC does here, that there are a lot of bigger fish down lower, then you tie on either a double nymph rig to get your flies all the way to that bottom third of the water column, or you can tie on a heavy streamer and pull it through the pool as well. Again, though, make sure you're working that pool in a grid pattern close to far. Like I said, fish are going to hold in random spots throughout the pools because usually when you get into these pools, there's very little current and there's not a whole lot of structure that's very easy to see from the surface. So it will feel like the fish are kind of just suspended randomly throughout the pool. And unless you see that clear structure in the pool, there's really not a surefire way to decide where in the pool those fish are going to hold. So if you approach it in that rigid, grid-like manner to make sure that you cover all the water that you possibly can, you won't miss out on potentially catching those bigger fish. And specifically, just make sure that you're just getting down. You asked about the depth, Casey. Just make sure you're getting down on the bottom, right? And you know your flies are on the bottom because you can feel them, or you're getting hung up on the bottom. That would be the depth to use. Just get down there, fish with nymphs, but cover all of the water column. Don't just focus on dries or nymphs. Cover all of it because you might be surprised at where those fish are holding. And with that, folks, that is going to wrap up episode 74 of Untangled. Thank you so much for watching and for listening and for engaging with this show. It is so much fun to see folks enjoying this. I love the fact that y'all love it. If you have any questions that you would like answered on the show, please do not hesitate to send them on in. That is what runs this show. It's all based on what you folks need to know about fly fishing. So please send those questions in. There is always a link in the podcast description. And you can also help the show out by rating and subscribing wherever you listen to this. That helps folks see the show. It makes it more visible in search results. It paints the picture, or it puts the bat signal up in the air to tell everybody, hey, go listen to Untangled. You need to listen to it. This is a valuable resource. So the more that you rate and subscribe, the more visible it makes the show. Helps us out a ton. And hey, until next week, get out there, get out on the water, have some fun, catch some fish, and tie lines, everybody.